You're good to go, Dr. Sanchez.
All righty. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. Once again, for this webinar series, I want to welcome you. I'm Dr. Javier Sanchez. I'm the past president of the San Bernardino County Medical Society, and I'm the program director for this new webinar series through the Inland Empire Climate Health Action Coalition. In the last, this is the third in a series of webinars we're putting together. We're very lucky today to have an excellent speaker who will give us an opportunity to learn more about the economic impact that climate change has here in the Inland Empire. So I just want to welcome you and thank you for being here. In the first webinar, we learned more about just the education of what climate change is and what the impact is in the Inland Empire and how we're seeing those changes. Our second webinar, we learn about how we can effectively communicate with our peers, with our communities, with our political representatives about the importance of climate change. And today we're going to talk more about just the economic impact. With that said, let me introduce Ms. Allison Elsner, our CEO, to make the presentation of our speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez. And I want to thank Dr. Javier Sanchez, who really is the force behind the establishment of this coalition, the IECHAC, the Climate Health Action Network. And this, as you know, and as he's referenced, is a collaboration between both county medical societies, San Bernardino County and Riverside County Medical Societies, as well as both departments of public health. And I see our immediate past public health officer, Dr. Sakura, is on with us today too. So we do appreciate that collaboration, and we appreciate your leadership on this, Dr. Sanchez, and getting this dialogue started for our community, and really it's extending statewide. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. We will encourage you to put your questions into the chat feature on Zoom so that while our speaker is presenting, you can be thinking of some questions, and we can get to those as soon as the presentation is concluded. And also for any of those of you who are medical providers and physicians, we do offer CME for this. Thanks very much to Loma Linda University Continuing Medical Education. We're grateful to them for their support of this series and our CME outreach on this. Real quickly, you also saw a reference to Assembly Member, now Senator Eloise Reyes, and unfortunately, she has a pretty big conflict today, which was unexpected before she transitioned her office. So we are excited that Mr. Granillo is going to be our star presenter today. So with that, I would like to introduce Paul Granillo, President and Chief Executive Officer, Inland Empire Economic Partnership. Paul Granillo has served as CEO since 2010. During that time, IEEP, the Inland Empire Economic Partnership, has become one of the most recognized statewide organizations focused on galvanizing cross-sector leadership in order to build a stronger regional economy through a triple bottom line framework. IEEP has a strong policy focus and works in Washington, D.C., Sacramento, and locally to ensure the San Bernardino and Riverside County issues are well represented. Paul has also put a special focus on leadership training for the region's public and private sectors next generation. He sits on many national and statewide boards, and he also serves on the Southern California Association of Governments Global Land Use and Economics Committee, the Leonard Transportation Center, Californians Dedicated to Education Foundation, and is past president of the Board of Trustees at the Riverside Art Museum Cheech Center for Chicano Art. A native of the Inland Empire, Paul was born and raised in Redlands, California. He received a BA in history from Cal State University San Bernardino, a Master of Divinity from St. John's Seminary in Camarillo, and a licentiate in canon law from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Mr. Granillo, we're incredibly honored to have you today. Thank you for joining us, and please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. As Allison said, I intended to be on with my good friend, Senator Reyes. But as they say, 80% of success is showing up. So let her know that I was here and ready to go. So, but I do appreciate the opportunity. And I think that your topic is absolutely key for the region, because there is really, when you talk about the Inland Empire and you talk about issues of health and economic well-being and equity, you're going to be hard pushed to find another region where those issues come together. And so what I would like to do is change what I had planned to do and just really have a little conversation and present some numbers that I think are really important for your discussion today and moving forward. So as Allison said in my bio, I am a native of the Inland Empire. My family has been in the Inland Empire for 130 years. In Redlands, if you go to the turn of the last century, my grandparents had a 3-digit number in the phone book in 1899, right? So I understand the Inland Empire, and in my lifetime, I've seen it change from what was very agrarian. Obviously the citrus industry that was here in this region of Southern California was incredibly important. And over time, we've seen that transition. The issues of climate are certainly key, and we need to pay attention to climate change because it's going to affect us all. It's affecting all of us. And the way that my organization, which is comprised of the larger employers of the public and private side in the Inland Empire, try and deal with these issues is through the triple bottom line, right? That we look at equity, we look at the environment, and we look at the economics, and those are always going to be in tension, okay? And that's the key. That's going to be the difficult part, because each and every one of us has probably an inclination to go towards one of those corners, right? The economy, equity, and the environment. I would propose that the best solutions come when people come together from those different perspectives and really work on solutions. That's the way that we're going to get to where we need to go. And if we go in any one direction too far, then things get out of whack. And ultimately, we don't get to the right solutions. And it's the people that get hurt by that, that usually least have a voice in how those decisions are made, okay? So triple bottom line, very important to us. All right, so let's get into the numbers. We want to talk about the Inland Empire, and the Inland Empire is defined by the United States Census as the Riverside, San Bernardino, Ontario Metropolitan Statistical Area. So what that means is it encompasses the totality of Riverside and San Bernardino counties. The census does that when it looks at populations, when it looks at connective tissue, like economic drivers, when it looks at demographics. And so the Inland Empire, the counties of Riverside and San Bernardino, they're interlocked. They're interlocked. The majority of people that commute to work commute from one county to another, okay? That ties us together. When we shop, people who live in Riverside go to Victoria Gardens, okay? When we play, we go out to the Coachella Valley, we go up and ski in the mountains, we go down to Temecula and drink wine, Okay, so that's the connective tissue of a metropolitan statistical area. So there are 390 metropolitan statistical areas in the United States. Currently, the Inland Empire is the 12th largest. Okay, so let that sink in. The Inland Empire is actually bigger than 25 states, all right, by population. We are have a very large population, and we have a very large area. 27,000 square miles comprise the Inland Empire. Just to compare, to give you a comparison, Riverside, it's rectangular, right? So it's kind of like it's the same size as New Jersey, all right? San Bernardino County, same size as Israel, all right? So this is a big, big area. Okay, 12th largest MSA. So where does that put us? It puts us ahead of San Diego. It puts us ahead of San Francisco. We are about 150,000 people from passing Boston, Cambridge, and about 400,000 from passing Phoenix. Because of the growth of the Inland Empire, we're going to pass Boston, we're going to pass Phoenix, and we'll be in the top 10. So who's the largest MSA? New York. Who's the second largest? Los Angeles. Who's the third? Chicago. All right. So think of the company we keep, right? We are a big place. Now, if I went down from New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago in the top 10, every single one of those MSAs would have a major city linked to it. The issue with the Inland Empire is that we have no major city, right? We have very large cities. And if we were in other states, cities like Riverside, which is our largest city at 325,000, that's a big city. San Bernardino is a city of 200,000. And then we have a grouping of cities, about 10, of over 100,000. And so we have a big population, but there's no big city that really defines us. And that's always been an issue for the Inland Empire, because it's hard to define yourself when you don't have that city. And I think that's one of the issues that we all have to grapple with moving forward, is telling our own story and not letting other people tell our story. Okay, let's talk about equity and our demographics, right? So 12th largest MSA, the Inland Empire has the 5th largest Latino population in the United States. Half of the population of the Inland Empire, 4.7 million, half of the population is Latino, okay? So that's the largest Latino population is in Los Angeles, second largest in New York. Then we go down to Miami, Houston, Chicago, and we're right there, okay? So when we talk about healthcare, and you guys know better than I do, the issues that affect the Latino population, whether that's issues of obesity, diabetes, heart issues, that is a big population that we need to be taken care of. And again, this is part of the issue for the Inland Empire when it comes to being one of the regions in the United States that is understaffed in medical personnel. And again, you all know that, you live that, but it's a big issue for us. And again, we continue to grow. Why do we continue to grow? We continue to grow because it's Southern California, it's a great place to live, and it's affordable. The median house in California in California has now exceeded $1 million, right? That's just crazy, right? My parents bought their home in Redlands in 1972 for $12,000, okay? and that house built in 1958 is, now worth probably $700,000, okay? Nice investment, right? But that's an issue for us. So affordability drives in California, and housing drives population growth. So the average 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in San Bernardino County is about $550,000. It's about $600,000 in Riverside. Okay, so it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. Got it? Now you take that house like the Wizard of Oz, you pick it up, you move it from Upland across Monte Vista, and you land it in Claremont, and that house just gained $400,000. Okay, you move it from Upland over to Irvine, and it gains $1 million. Okay, it's the same 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. Okay, and yet that's what people are having to deal with, right? It's to choosing if they want to have a house, if they want to have generational wealth, that's where they're going to come to the Inland Empire. So that's a big driver for us. One of the most difficult numbers in this conversation about equity, the environment, and the economy is educational attainment. So we're a big region, right? One of the biggest in the country. We're diverse, all right? But when it comes to baccalaureate attainment, all right, and I know that I'm speaking to a Zoom full of well-educated people, okay? And I have to say, we are not the average resident of the Inland Empire. Our baccalaureate attainment for 4.7 million people sits at 21%, okay? 21%. And in the Latino population, the half of our Inland Empire residents, baccalaureate attainment is at 9%, all right? So so the most educated county in Southern California is Orange County, most residents with baccalaureate degrees, and they sit at 43%, okay? This is a key issue for us, right? Because what it does is it limits an economy. Your workforce and the educational level of your workforce limits or helps your economy to grow. So what part of the economy is not in the Inland Empire? The tech economy is not here. And what is tech? Tech is ideas. Tech is video games. Tech is software. Tech is artificial intelligence, virtual reality. Because we sit at 21% baccalaureate attainment, those jobs in tech, which are the best paying jobs, we don't have that sector of the economy here, okay? And our young and not so young people that want to work in tech, they need to leave the region, okay? So it becomes a chicken and the egg issue, right? It's not that we don't produce bright students, right, that can participate in that sector, but the sector is not here. And so they go to other places, obviously, up north to Silicon Valley, to Boston, to Austin, and other places where tech has a real footprint. So what does that mean? Okay. 21% baccalaureate attainment means that 79% of the population don't have that degree. And if we start to cut that group up, you're going to find a group that didn't graduate high school, some that graduated high school, some that have some community college, okay? And that makes regions like the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, Kern County, that makes them heavily reliant on what we would call blue-collar jobs, all right? Manufacturing jobs. In the Inland Empire, our major driver after healthcare is the supply chain and logistics, okay? We're going to have to deal with this issue of how we work towards our climate goals and how we keep a job base for individuals. And that's really one of those tensions that exists here in the Inland Empire. And I think that's probably the reason we're having this conversation. And the issues here are real, because if there wasn't this sector, if we just took out the whole sector, there's nothing really behind it anymore. Then you have to start to talk about retail jobs in retail, and that's problematic for reasons I will speak about. And then you get into service jobs, food service, and other jobs. That is very problematic, and we saw that played out in many regions of the Inland Empire. The Coachella Valley, for instance, 20% of its workforce ceases to be employed basically from June to September, okay? Because it's so heavily reliant on hospitality, and then it's just too damn hot, right? So people aren't out there. So we saw that play out in the pandemic, right? When those sectors shut down. So let's get into this question of that 21% baccalaureate, okay? And then we have to talk about who that population is, right? We are, from my perspective, right? We are lucky that we have the Inland Empire Health Plan, okay? And the numbers I've just given you, right? If you think I'm crazy or wrong, right? Then let me give you one from healthcare, right? 1 in 4 residents of the Inland Empire, right, rely on the Inland Empire Health Plan for their healthcare. And why is that? It is because of the numbers that I've just laid out, okay? And so we have to be grateful for IECHA and the job that they're doing for 1.6 million residents of the Inland Empire. And I said we got 4.7 million residents in the region, right? So that's where we begin to see these numbers play out. And then we need to talk about the supply chain and why logistics, warehousing, trucking is so important and so much a part of our lives, right? And let me say, to make sure that you get my perspective, I am not pro warehouse, right? But I am pro job. And I am pro job because as we look at the social determinants of health, right? 30% relies on the social economic, right? It's where do people have a job, right? Do they have a job that provides them health care? Do they have a job that provides them incentives to be healthy, right? And to make healthy choices. And when people don't have a job, they don't have necessarily access to healthcare, which is a problem. And then they also make bad health decisions. So the importance of employment in a region like ours can't be overstated from my perspective. The logistics and the supply chain. While we are here on this Zoom, it is also Christmas. And some of you with your cameras off, right, could be ordering Christmas gifts, right? Anytime I'm in a room giving a speech, right, and there's 300 people in a room, somebody, Amazon, Target, Walmart, is making money, okay? Because that's how we have chosen now to purchase goods, right? There was an article in the Wall Street Journal and followed up by CNN and MSNBC that Macy's retail out the money it makes in its stores is less than the worth of the property that Macy's owns. Okay, so basically, all of the retail that Macy's does doesn't make it enough money anymore, right? And why is that? Why is there no more Sears? Why is there no more Kmart? Why is there no more Mervyn's? I saw a presentation about 6 years ago from a high-level executive at UPS, and he laid out the stores that were gone, and he laid out all the stores that were going to go. And the last one standing was basically going to be Nordstrom's, okay? And darn it, if we just haven't watched that march of those stores go bankrupt and disappear. Friends, we are the cause, okay? Now, unless you're a diehard and you just say, I'm never going to order anything online, that is the way that people are choosing to purchase goods. The pandemic, it fast forwarded the use of what is known as fulfillment, where we press a button and it gets to our house the next day, if not the same day. The pandemic fast forwarded that, and it broadened the amount of stuff we could have arrive at our home, right? Most of us didn't used to have our pharmaceuticals delivered to our house, right? We didn't have the groceries delivered to our house. It was an option, right? But the pandemic made it easier for us to do that, right? Total Wine will gladly deliver, a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc to your front door, okay? It changed the way it was already changing, and it fast forwarded that. And so we have to appreciate our role in the need for us to want to purchase goods using fulfillment, and the relationship that has to the need for the providers of that service to have warehouses for that stuff, to have trucks for that stuff. And we have to appreciate that we have a role to play in what's going on. And as much as you could be committed, it's never going to go back, right? All of the surveys say that we like this and we want more of it. I can tell you I have seen a demonstration of let's just call it a UPS-like truck that pulls up in front of your house. Those of you working at home, a lot more trucks are pulling up now because of Christmas, right? The day is coming when the truck will pull up in front of your house, a ramp will come down, and there'll be about 10 little robots that'll roll down the ramp and go to your neighbor's house, deliver their packages, and then roll back, get back on the truck and take off, right? So that's the automated delivery that is coming. And we know that the drone delivery, aerial drones, are coming too. So we live in an interesting time. We are seeing changes in that system, and we as consumers are using it. The reason that it's such a big deal in the Unknown Empire is our proximity to the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. If I can use a heart example, right? There are only so many arteries into the heart, okay? And that's the same with any type of trade that comes into any country, okay? So we had a presentation from a chief economist of one of the major companies, worldwide companies, and they showed us a picture of houses and delivery trucks and warehouses. And they said, where is this? And people in the room said, well, that looks like Fontana. Some others said that looks like Rialto. And then the chief economist, she says, no, this is Spain, okay? She shows another picture, same thing, warehouses, houses, trucks. She says, where is this? Nobody answers because they got burnt on the first time, right? And she says, this is the Netherlands, okay? So these are places in the world that are closely in proximity to ports, okay? And so goods that we consume Many times are manufactured in other countries on the Pacific Rim, and they are shipped to us. And this phenomena that we live in the Inland Empire is not just us, right? It is also in other parts of the world, okay? And we need to appreciate that when we look at fixes. Okay, so lots of data points. I want to land and I want to take some questions. We as a community, and I would ask you as medical leaders, right? Too often, I said we allow others to define us, right? You know, if I use this as an example, if the Inland Empire is the lead story on channel 2, 4, 5, 9, then somebody's dead, right? Somebody's been arrested, or something's on fire, okay? Because we're the largest media market without its own media, right? We're held captive to the Los Angeles television market, okay? The Redlands Daily Facts, the Press Enterprise, the Inland Valley Bulletin, the San Bernardino Sun are all the same newspaper because they're all owned by the Southern California News Group, the Media News, okay? And you know, you're all well-educated people, so you know what the loss of local media means and the stories that we get to read and get told about us. There's a million good things that happen in the Inland Empire beyond warehouses and trucks, right? The fact of the matter is that the trucking fleet within 20 to 25 years, right, will be either driven by hydrogen or batteries, okay? So you'll have a near zero fleet, all right? But you and I are still gonna need our stuff, right? And nothing that you're wearing, nothing that's in the room that you're at got there except for being on a truck. So that will not change. We should be a world leader in zero emissions, near zero emissions supply chain. We have the ability to do that, but that's going to require investment. We need to work with our cities and the counties, right, to make sure that when we're building facilities, right, we're building them for generations to serve people, but also that it adds to the quality of life and doesn't take away from quality of life. But if we just keep yelling at each other and not having serious conversations about the need to meet our climate goals and yet maintain an economy for a very large population, and the jobs that those people should be entitled to, the quality of life and the dream, right, of being able to take care of your family and your kids and leave something, we're going to be in a lot of problems. And too often I just see people talking past each other. And so that's why I think your topic today is so important. Again, I wish I could have been able to engage with my friend Eloise, but we'll do that down the line. I hope this was helpful from trying to give you a sense of the economics that we're up against, and maybe a larger perspective of this question about how we balance these things out. So with that, Allison and Dr. Sanchez, I will turn it back to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that eye-opening presentation and really giving us a lot to think about, especially our own responsibility of what it takes. I've known your family for pretty much ever since I got here in the Inland Empire, so I know that your family has been around here for such a long time. And it's great to see how your family has grown and expanded and has really worked to make the Inland Empire more livable for all of us. So I really thank you for that. As you know, one of the reasons sort of that the logistic industry became such a huge industry here in the Inland Empire is because of the economist John Hewson, that back in the 70s and 80s, he really felt that that was the only way to grow the Inland Empire and to grow the Southern California economy. Now we're really looking at ways to sort of mitigate some of that. And you mentioned some of the things we can do and some of the things that your organization is working with some of the folks in industry. So I'm hoping that maybe you can expand a little bit on what are some of those, other than developing zero emission trucks and things like that, what other mitigating things that your industry or industry as a whole needs to take here in the Inland Empire to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Yeah, and I would say, Doctor, it's all of us. So we had at one of our summits, economic summits, the chief logistics officer for Kaiser. And the question that was posed to him, how long can the average hospital stay working without being resupplied? And the answer was a day, maybe two. Okay. So when we talk about this issue of trucks and warehouses, let's not forget that healthcare is a big user of those facilities, and it necessitates those facilities, right? Cardinal Health, right, exists to make sure that those things that the hospital needs get there, and other companies that are working in Redlands and Ontario that are situated there to be the backbone necessary to keep our healthcare system working. So, you know, as we dig into your question, it becomes a little bit more complex, right? We're going to go to Vons, we're going to go to Stater Brothers, and that requires an infrastructure of warehouses and trucks to make sure that we can go and get that. So I think that when we get to these questions, right, the cutting edge of where we need to be is the smaller you make the truck, okay, the easier it is to electrify it, okay? And so one of the pushes, and I just saw this in New York, where they've taken what was a 1960s low-income housing facility, right, that has been replaced, but the buildings are still there, and Amazon has bought them, okay? And they're going to retrofit them into fulfillment, which is going to allow smaller vans, right, electric vans, which will allow, I would think, at some point, aerial drone delivery. And the reason they bought that property is so that people in New York can get their stuff, but it's located near them, right? Within maybe 5 miles of, you know, 1 million people, okay? So we need to look at those technologies. We need to become better at tracking things, right? No truck should ever be half full, right? We need to have less truck trips and have those trips be more effective. We need to look at where things are. And when we talk about warehousing, it's not just about the ports of LA and Long Beach. You also have to realize that this is Southern California, one of the largest regions of the world when in population. You look at the map at night and it's a lot of lights, right? Because it's 25 million people. And in this Southern California area, there's a lot of manufacturing. There's food manufacturing. There's, you know, everything from tamales, right, to rolled steel at California Steel, okay? So those warehouses and those trucks are also supporting the manufacturing world, and manufacturing jobs are some of our best jobs. So there's a system there. And part of that should be that things that we want to have on Christmas that we're not going to need till next Christmas, that should all be shipped way out. You should imagine circles, right? One truck trip out, one truck trip back when it's time. We need to get better about that. We need to use use artificial intelligence that can help us think of new ways to where we put things. I also would say, to your question, we need to look at dedicated truck lanes, right? Separating goods movement from people movement in ways that would help everybody. And the big issue there, you haven't asked me about what's in the way, right? But the infrastructure to do that is what we need to focus on. So those are some of the things that industry is working on, that are best practices, not only in the United States, but in places in Europe where regulatory systems are even more prevalent than here in Southern California.
I'm going to pass it on to our CEO, Ms. Essler, to ask the others additional questions and to moderate the questions. But thank you for calling out the healthcare industry. We are, as you can see, a lot of the folks in this call and are not only involved in climate change, but also involved in pushing our healthcare sector to decrease their emissions and get us down to zero emissions. So thank you so much for calling us out on that. Ms.
Sure.
Alves?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I have a few questions too in a moment if we have time, but before we get, I see Dr. Sakara has his hand up. I want to jump to this chat question that came in first. How do we influence current policymakers without being anti-capitalist? So how do we reconcile these things?
That's a great question, right? I think that, and I'm not taking anybody's right away to decide where they think, what they think about economics, right? But at the end of the day, in the United States, we have a capitalist economy, right? And so if no one is creating money, right? So I open a store, I want to make a profit so that I can, take care of my family. And then I want to make sure that I have what's needed to keep my store open. And I have to deal with competition if somebody opens a store next to mine. So then I need to invest in new technologies, right? That all costs money. At the end of the day, if I'm successful, then I'm employing people and paying them and giving them an opportunity to make a livelihood. If I'm successful, I, as an owner of that business, and my employees are paying taxes. Those taxes go to support the government, right? And the basic things that we decide we want our government to provide, whether that's streets or infrastructure, whether it's defense, whether it's healthcare for those that can't afford it, whether it's healthcare for all of us. Healthcare is something that we should all have the ability to tap into. That's the structure we live under, okay? And if we want to live under something else, then we need to look at the trade-offs for that, okay? And you can look at other countries, and if the trade-off is that 50 cents of every dollar I make is going to go to support government and government services, well, that's the deal I make. But the question that you raise is a big one, because if we disincentivize investment, and California has certain markers that say that people are not investing in California, there's a downstream effect to that. We need to realize that 1% of Californians, 39 million people, 1% of Californians pay half the taxes in this state. Okay? Half the taxes. And that is really the tech industry that keeps the state going, right? So we've had a massive deficit. We're seeing some changes in that, and that's going to have to be because one of those tech companies has done really well. Okay. Now, if the tech industry decides to leave California, where are we going to be? And the things that we care about as Californians, as a progressive state, that are important to us, who's going to pay for those? So your question is a good one. But the economic realities, say that this is a question that needs to be grappled with.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sakura, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. And Paul, it's great to see you. And
I saw you the other day.
yeah. And I would like to speak from the perspective of public health as well. And I've really been ambivalent as health officer in this whole issue of on the total effect of warehouses on public health, because I can tell you that the job development, the economic improvement has really made a big difference in probably 4 out of the 5 significant social drivers of health in terms of improved economy, improved educational level, transportation, increased access to medical care. All of it's improved with improved economic development. So it's really specious for us to think and for us to look at warehouses alone and saying they're bad, because there are clear-cut benefits to the health, the public health of this our 2 counties because of the economic development, which then drives school development, which drives more clinics and hospitals. And the more patients we have, the better our health clinics and hospitals grow. So it clearly is an issue that requires of us working together, and for really for all of us to have a holistic approach. I mean, if you look at one end, you look at Beijing and all of the industrial cities in China where they can't see across the street. We don't want to go that way, and we don't have to. But some of these are statements and not a question yet. I'll get to my question, Paul. But just from the perspective of public health, it's not a black and white picture at all. And so I do agree, though, and I think that we need to work together, and we need to look at mitigation, and can we have both our cake and eat it too? And I think just by virtue of its location, the Inland Empire, we are part of basically the rim that basically services our economy from our ports all the way from Asia all the way through Japan, China. So it's a prime opportunity for us to improve our economy, et cetera. So the thing that probably the most important thing is to look at mitigation. For instance, and the big question is, how can we get more of a say on this? When I drive past these miles and miles of warehouses, I think of the urban island effect. The more concrete, the more buildings that we have, the more it adds to probably a more important climate issue than air, which is heat and our climate and the whole issue. I don't know whether businesses know about the urban heat island effect, but when the more concrete you have, the more it actually increases the ambient temperature, the average ambient temperature, by 30-40%. So and those are the things that we don't want to make it unfriendly or uninviting for businesses to come in. And we have to be realistic that warehouses are a part of our existence. But I think it's if we hope that our businesses and government will take the health effects and the mitigation effects into factor. For instance, one of my thoughts when I look at all these miles of warehouses is, why can't we put either solar panels or even grass on their ceilings that would help the CO2, help the heat, but it probably collapse their ceilings if they put in grass. But things like that, or solar panels, et cetera, that would actually decrease our reliance on air or increase our capacity for air conditioning, so that we can develop more cooling centers, et cetera. So Paul, any thoughts on that? Just in terms of when we had our session in long range planning, it was really difficult because the businesses that are on our community-based organizations, they basically started out with, don't talk about warehouses because we're not going anywhere with those. So we need to work together and completely about the
yeah, we need to work together, and I'm a big table person, right? And if we're good stewards of our region, right, we should be able to find ways to deal with these. So the issue of solar is certainly one that the industry is aware of and working towards. The years ago, the question of the weight on the roof was real. As you said, it was just too heavy. Nowadays, you're seeing more facilities do that. There's a company called Prologis, a very big developer, international company. They just took down a building, took it down in order to build a large charging facility for electric trucks, right? And so can you imagine that? You build a building and then you say no, but the value is in we need to support the electric trucks. And so took a whole building down and created that charging center. We need to look at how we consume things, right? So one of the issues, and I'm guilty, right? Amazon says, hey, do you want it today, or do you want all of these things on Saturday? Right? When it'll come in, that's called the basket effect. We put everything in the basket and it comes that way. So that's a big issue. We need to, I think that there are great opportunities, but what we lack is, and we're a big proponent of this, is a center of excellence in the supply chain, where a community our size, which should be a living laboratory, given everything that's possible and everything that's being done and every issue that we have, we should have a place where that research is being done and funded. And so I'm a big advocate for us to, labor and the environmental movement, industry, to come together and say, let's create Switzerland to help us study these things, so that we're not, again, yelling past each other, but we're coming up with real solutions that are going to be sustainable as we move into the next century.
Thank you so much. Wow. So I want to mention a couple things, and I have a really quick question. Then we've got another question in the chat as well. You mentioned the Amazon situation, and I think that's a really, really big factor. I think it's changed our entire culture, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it's important. Well, I'll speak about myself, to be realistic about what's going on, and that is when Amazon presents you with an option between getting something between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. or 10 a.m. the next day, we can click the box 4 a.m. Well, these things are leading to what you're talking about, Mr. Granillo, and that is probably sending trucks out that aren't full. So I don't know how we reconcile that, because Amazon's business model is genius. It's revolutionized the way we conduct the supply chain and receive our goods and services, but it's also, realistically speaking, I'm a huge part of this problem. I'm getting things from Amazon, and I'll be modest here and saying at least 3 times a week. And that's embarrassing, but it's happening. And if I'm just one person and you're looking at the hospitals and things like that, I think a lot of it is what you alluded to, and that is proper organizational structure and infrastructure about how these trucks are being sent out and things like that. So I'm really fascinated by that, and by all of us kind of taking ownership, what you say, Dr. Sakura, to the responsibility we have in our role, and maybe advancing some of these issues, some of the negative impacts, because it's happening. It's our way of life, and we demand things instantly now. The other thing I'm thinking of are models that have been established in places like Singapore and Southeast Asia. Some of the architecture and Moshe Safdie and architects like that, they've really come up with some amazing ways to, like at the airport and Changi Airport in Singapore, to create kind of these self-sustaining environments where they're generating CO2 and all of this. And I just wonder how they fare in comparison to what we're doing here in the US, and are there any lessons to be learned from any locales like that, or is there anything there?
Yeah, no, great example, Allison, and call me Paul, please. So let's take, for instance, the Arrow. Okay, so the Arrow project is it's one of the first zero emission small trains that's running from San Bernardino to the University of Redlands. Okay. It's capable of running all the way to Union Station. All right. So you now have a zero emission train, okay, which is on the smaller European style, correct? So what you would see in downtown Cologne is a similar kind of train. So what UPS and FedEx, DHL do many times with that type of a train is they'll actually have a dedicated car, okay? Because the train stops, so the Arrow is going, well, let's take the Metrolink, right? So coming from Union Station, it's going to stop in West Covina, it's going to stop in Rialto, it's going to eventually get to Redlands. Well, if you had a car with packages, right, for DHL and UPS and FedEx, as it pulls into that neighborhood, right, you can take that stuff off, and you're going to be again within that magic, 3-4 miles of delivery. And again, you could use an all electric delivery system. Okay, so that's one way of using transit to deal with the issue. Okay. Also, I think there's going to be discussions about just special trains that are able to, and we have rail yards in the Inland Empire, Fontana, Rialto, and certainly Colton and San Bernardino. How are we utilizing them and allowing them to have different types of conveyance systems directly from those trucks? BNSF is building a new facility in Barstow, really to try and mitigate the number of trucks that have to come down the hill, and trains as well. So the industry is looking at it very seriously, and we just have to, again, be on the cutting edge of technology and not trying to come into it at the end, right? We should be having the questions you're asking. We should be trying to come up with solutions here. And right now they might be outside of the box, but believe it or not, there is a drone that's going to land on your roof within 5 years, I would say. It's coming.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, awesome. There is a question that came in here. Let me just back up a moment. It's kind of 2 parts. Our questioner is asking, we should really like to know your thoughts on the green hydrogen company IECHA. wait till, I don't know if you see that in the chat, maybe, she said it's publicly traded and the CEO is a super brilliant African-American entrepreneur with connections to DC. Does that sound familiar? Is that?
I don't know the company, but green hydrogen is obviously a great opportunity. We're doing some work with some friends up in the Sierras on biomass, right? So places that have a lot of forest when you're trying to deal with fire mitigation and climate change, where you're looking at clearing areas of forest to make sure that it's not going to burn. You're seeing biomass used, so you take the wood, right, and then you convert that into hydrogen. Okay, and so part of the work that we're doing is to be the connectivity to say, how do we use biomass in our own forests, right, to drive green hydrogen when it comes to the supply chain. And again, so there's one of those outside the box concepts. But as I sit here in Claremont and I'm looking up at the mountains, right, it's a reality that I don't think we're leaning into as much as we can. So I don't know the company, but the concept is great. So, but because it's publicly traded, I will look it up. Okay. So.
Paul, you mentioned the creation of a little Switzerland, or one of my thoughts was that, I do know that, for instance, the owner of Patagonia has donated the value of their entire profit to climate research, and Jack Dangerman with Esri has also donated a significant, and I'd love it if our Amazon CEO would do that as well. But do we have anything within the Inland Empire that would actually work towards getting some of this research money and developing some of these projects in terms of building infrastructure, enhancing solar energy and cooling, all of the things that we need, because we know the super train is going to end up in Rancho Cucamonga, so it's going to be more traffic for us. So do we have anything going after the grants to develop these projects?
Yeah, we're working with UCR. We work with Cal State San Bernardino, right? And this issue is something that we work with. I've had meetings in Washington and in Sacramento. It's an investment that needs to be made, but it needs to be a real partnership between, again, the environmentalists, labor, and industry. And that's always the rub, right? And so we need to keep putting that out there. The other issue for the Inland Empire that I didn't mention is that the Fortune 500 are here. They're doing business here. But we have very few decision makers here, right? So I've had to travel to Atlanta to meet with leadership of UPS, of Coca-Cola. So you have to go to those places where the decisions are being made. And again, we need to tell our story. I have obviously industry members, and one of our expectations is that they're good corporate citizens, and we're not going to have relationships with people that aren't good corporate citizens, and so that that's an expectation. But we need to, as a region, do a better job of making our asks. What we need investment in, and they need to make sure that they don't view us as greater Los Angeles, that we're our own region, and that there's an upside to their bottom line is being in business here, but they need to make sure that they're giving back.
Any thoughts on the impact of this new administration on
That's a loaded question, Doctor. So, I sit on the board of directors of Unidos US, which is the largest Latino civil rights organization in the US. And so, you know, I have my concerns. I think that mass deportation is going to have, besides the human issues, which obviously come first, that's going to have a negative economic impact on people. We rely on, you know, many undocumented people to feed us, okay, to keep us in fruits and vegetables. So that's problematic. The issue of tariffs obviously has a downside effect for regions like us. And, you know, 1 in 6 jobs in Southern California is in the supply chain. And so if those tariffs affect trade into the United States, that will have an impact in Southern California and the Inland Empire. So those would be the top 2 issues in the new administration that I think would have an immediate effect on the economics of the region.
So I think we're going to, it looks like we're getting close to our time here. So we're going to wrap things up, and I want to turn this back over to Dr. Sanchez. But Dr. Secura, thanks for your comments. And Paul, that was just really, really eye-opening and thought-provoking. So we want to thank you so much for this. Dr. Sanchez, we want to turn this back over to you for some comments to close it out today.
No, thank you so much. It's been so informative and some great questions and great comments that everybody put forth. And I want to throw this out to Mr. Granillo. Is one of the reasons we formed the Inland Empire Climate Health Action Coalition is to really bring people together, to really start thinking and really lead in the Inland Empire on climate change, and not just sit and wait for others to make decisions for us. So this is a coalition between us, between the San Bernardino County Medical Society, between the Riverside County Medical Society, the both public health departments, and then any of you who want to be part of this, so we can have these conversations. We don't want this to be a one and done. We want this to be a conversation so we can build on this and then continue to find solutions and come and work together to make this a better place for all of us, since most of us will be here for a while. And we can lead and show what can be done here in the Inland Empire, but also everywhere in the world. As you mentioned, this is not just an issue that relates to the Inland Empire. This is an issue that relates to the whole US, to the whole world as a whole. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak to us. We look forward to working with you in the future, and feel free to reach out to us. And on behalf of the Inland Empire and the San Bernardino County Medical Society, I want to thank you for coming and spending time with us. I want to wish you the best of holidays. And also I want to remind you that we have some upcoming webinars. Our next webinar is going to be on January 22nd. It's going to, we're going to talk actually on the climate health aspect and the public health and what our public health agencies are doing here in the Inland Empire when it comes to climate change. So I welcome you to come and join us, and feel free to register. And again, feel free to share this with anybody that you feel should be here with us. If you want to join our coalition, feel free to do that. If you have any questions or any concerns, feel free to reach out to us. And again, happy holidays and have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.